Back on April 26, 2003, there was a young man who was a hiker, still is to this day, and he was going through some mountains in Utah when famously an 800-pound boulder fell on top of him. More specifically, it fell on top of his arm. There he remained for 5 long days, 5 long nights. Many would assume that death was coming upon him. But he did not give up. And though he only had a very small flask of water left, he made it last for those 5 days. And after 5 days of trying to pull himself from the rock, trying to chip away at the rock, he finally turned his attention to his own arm. And in the movie 127 Hours, he famously chopped, it's a true story that he actually cut off his arm, and then with his body so broken, rappelled away down the mountain and eventually was rescued. I share this story with you because this and so many other stories of human beings who are caught in a place where it seems that death is inevitable find such a push, such a drive to do superhuman feats in order to survive and to continue living. My younger brothers and my older brother, when we were growing up, we would see who could hold their breath the longest. And we'd have our clench our fist to our nose and keeping our mouth shut. And after you get to about the 2-minute mark, you'll find that your limbs start shaking and your body's kind of convulsing as your body is fighting itself to stay alive. Truly, one of the most basic and universal human impulses is the human impulse to stay alive, to fight for life, no matter what. So what is it that leads someone to want death? What is it, despite the fact that this is so fundamental to being human, is for you at such a deep level that it just craves to be alive? What is it that leads someone to want suicide and assistance in that? What is it? What a confusing thing to walk with people through that season when there's such pain, when there's such confusion, when there's such hopelessness in someone's life that they are actually looking for help, not to live, but to die. In that moral question of how we address such things and such situations like that, on February 6, 2015, just this year, the Supreme Court of Canada in Carter v. Canada struck down the existing provisions in the criminal code that prohibited assisted suicide. What they struck down in the criminal code is section 241B, which states everyone who aids or abets a person to commit suicide, whether suicide ensues or not, is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years. So they struck down the provision in Canada's criminal code that prevented people from encouraging or assisting or aiding anyone to commit suicide. They struck it down based on Section 7 of the Charter, which famously reads that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the laws of fundamental justice. I'm sure those who wrote those words never imagined that the right to life would be used to promote the right to assisted suicide. This truly is a morally confusing issue. The Supreme Court of Canada said that the existing provision of the criminal code would survive for 12 months, and then on February 6th of 2016, if the Parliament of Canada does not come up with a new law, then there will be no law, and that section will simply be missing from the criminal code. So how do we address this? How do we address specific situations where people are looking for help to die, to commit suicide? And how do we address a society that's where it's at today, where our Supreme Court is making such decisions? Well, if you're like me, these are tough questions, and so as I thought, how do we address this tonight, what better place to turn to than to God Himself? So we're going to be looking at a passage tonight in the Bible. If you have a Bible, please turn to 1 Kings chapter 19. I'm going to be reading from the ESV, so if you have a Bible, please pull it out, or maybe look to your phone right now. I'll assume that you're reading the Bible on your phone or not checking Facebook. We're going to look at in this passage where a prophet has just experienced some of the most incredible experiences someone can experience. Where fire has just fallen from heaven and the enemies of God have just been defeated. We would all think that this prophet would be so pumped up on the goodness of God and the glories of which he's seen. But the passage we're about to see, a passage I think all of us know so well. In this passage, this man of God looks for assisted suicide, looks for physician-assisted suicide. In this case, he looks at the great physician for assisted suicide. So as we turn there in our Bibles or our phones, first let's pray again. Heavenly Father, thank you that you who created the universe, you who is the very author of life, you are with us here in the room tonight. And Lord, though you are invisible, we long to see you. We long to know you more. And we long for your help, for your presence in our lives and in our churches and in our communities as we seek to address this painful and confusing issue. This issue of people wanting help committing suicide. Lord, we look to you that you would speak to us richly through your word and through my words tonight. God, I pray that somehow you would make this evening useful to every one of us, including myself, that you would illuminate your word tonight, illuminate your heart to us tonight. That as a result of this talk, as a result of this next 30, 40 minutes, we might actually come to know more of your character and more of who you are and more of how we can be carriers of your light in this world. Lord, this task is too big for me. I know it. Would you please help me and speak through me, your servant, tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 18. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then Elijah was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him, and said, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose, ate, and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Then he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Mohalah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elijah put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So in the passages that we just read here in God's word, Elijah has just experienced such great and glorious things of God. And as a result, many of us, if we were Elijah's friend, would be very surprised to see that Elijah, the very next day, is looking for death. Elijah does not fit the profile of the person we would think would be desiring assisted suicide. And this is often the case. If you're familiar with the issue of suicide and assisted suicide, so often those who who contemplate and who attempt suicide are not those who expect to commit suicide. But here he is, a man of God, Elijah, a man who's experienced such glorious things, such victory, such strength, such goodness of God he has tasted and experienced. Now he wants death. And he runs into the wilderness. Elijah is someone who has so often heard the word of the Lord, and people would look to him for the word of the Lord. In this passage, the expression of the word of the Lord, that the word came, the expressions we see so often, so common in Elijah's life, is conspicuously missing as Elijah goes into the wilderness on a journey that he himself has taken. It's not commissioned by God. You get the picture that Elijah feels so far from God. You get the picture that Elijah feels isolated. His servant who's always with him he's left behind. And he is a man who is in a dark place. Cries out for death, looking to the great physician to be put to death. So I think it's fair to say he's looking for a physician-assisted suicide. And there he is. He asks that he might die, saying, "It is enough now. It is enough. O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And he falls asleep exhausted. And then an angel, a messenger of God, touches him and says to him, "Arise and eat." Elijah looks, and there is at his head a cake baked on hot stones. It's so easy for us, I think for any of us who care about the issues of the sanctity of human life, for these questions, these issues regarding abortion, euthanasia, to become issues and campaigns. And I know that it's certainly true for me because I serve on the board of National Campus Life Network. I'm very much involved in pro-life work across Canada. And so it's very easy for this to become simply an issue that we want to win at a national level. It's easy for us to go to marches, for us to do demonstrations. I had an incredible time in Florida back in February as part of a team of 30 people doing pro-life work on university campuses as we're trying to win people to the pro-life view. And we saw tons of university students become pro-life every single day. It's amazing when you're part of a movement like this and you're seeing that you're actually saving lives and winning on this issue. But we see here that although God is going to speak into Elijah's life and God is going to give Elijah exactly what he does not want, and God is going to address it in a number of ways, we see that the very first thing God does is that he bakes him a cake.
Wow.
And I share this with you because it's so easy for it to become an issue for us. But tonight we're going to look at weeping with those who lead practical, pastoral, and political solutions to the demand for assisted suicide. So we see that God's response to this demand for death, for assisted suicide, is that he cares for his need. God sees that where Elijah's at is not only a place where he needs for God to give him a new perspective on life, for God to share with him what God will share with them after 40 days from this point about there being hundreds of people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. These things are true, and so many of us who have a heart for truth and who have a heart for life, we want to share these things with people all the time, and there's so often a time to speak, and we often don't speak when we should. But in this case, the angel seems to hold his tongue on these things. The angel of the Lord instead just cares for him and meets his practical needs. So God cares for his need for food, God cares for his need for sleep, and God provides this for him. It's interesting to me that it's not simply that God provided manna. You gotta almost expect that at this point, Elijah, he's exhausted, he falls before God asleep in the wilderness, and God comes and gives him this heaven food, right? There's some miracle food that would have this spiritual properties to it. Instead, it's so earthy in its description. It says that it was a cake baked on hot stones. It seems as if the angel may have been there while Elijah's falling asleep exhausted, baking the food, cooking it on hot stones right there. It's so human, it's so earthy, it's so practical. God really cares about his practical needs. And so I want to challenge us tonight to look at this and embrace this as part of our response to the demand for assisted suicide. That we'll look at in a moment, there is room and need for us to go on marches, and that there's a room and a need for us to meet with politicians and speak into the culture, but that we would realize that there are people in our congregations and certainly in our communities and neighborhoods that although the human impulse is so strong to stay alive no matter what, that something's so fundamentally broken in them, if even just for a season, that they long for death. They long to be put to death. And so it's easy for us just to rebuke that view and say, how can you say that? The Bible says, thou shalt not kill, and all of this, but that's not what God does. God actually cares for him. The word compassion, it seems to me, every time it comes up in the Bible, is not a word of sympathy, it's not a word of rhetoric, it's not a word of tears, it's a word of action. You'll see the people crying out and moaning to God, and then God hears them and has compassion. And you know when you see the word compassion and it relates to God, it always means that finally God will act. The word compassion in English is a combination of the word passion, to suffer. It doesn't mean to enthusiasm or to be super passionate, passionate about that. That's not what it's about. It means to suffer, and com is the prefix, it means with. The word compassion means to suffer with those who are suffering. As someone who's been very enthusiastic about pro-life work, I had to come into this understanding that often when we go on a march or something, we do it to stand with the vulnerable. But I've learned over the years that to stand with the vulnerable means placing yourself in a position of vulnerability. I've worked in Part of the Hill now for 7 years, and I've seen that the difference between a photo op and real action is whether or not you're willing to actually stand with the vulnerable. When someone takes a photo op, which happens all the time in politics, with a vulnerable person, you can see that sometimes they're standing with them only for the photo, and then they go on with their campaign. But to actually make a difference, to have compassion means to suffer with. And so about 4.5 years ago, I joined a team of other people who live near downtown Ottawa, just 15 minutes from Parliament Hill, in a broken neighborhood that's shaped by crime and poverty and addiction, prostitution. And we've seen that to stand with the vulnerable means to actually go live among them. To have compassion does not mean that we just have sympathy or tears in our hearts, but that we actually take action as God does and go and be amongst them. Now, sometimes those who contemplate suicide are the funnest people to be with, and they just give you such energy when you chill with them, maybe. But in my experience with the people that I've been on the phone with as they're seriously thinking of taking their life, is that often when someone is going through such a dark season that they long for death, they're not always the funnest person to talk with. They're not always the pick-me-up in your day. It's profoundly draining. Maybe you've had a very long day in the office, then you've gone to a church event in the evening that you're preaching at, you just poured yourself out, you're vulnerable with everyone, sharing your personal stuff and all this stuff. You're exhausted, you feel exposed, as often preachers do, as I do when I preach. And then I come home, it's late at night, and I get a phone call from someone in an earlier time zone in Canada, so it's not even late for them, and they're seriously contemplating suicide. It's not something that I was looking for. But in order for that person to actually continue living, I had to stay on the phone, and I had to be present with them. I had to listen to them. I had to be with them, and I had to care for them, even as God cared for Elijah. There were some truths I needed to share with that person. There were some difficult things, some questions I had to ask. But the first thing I did was just listen, just be with them. One of the things at Church of the Messiah, where I'm a ministry intern at, is contemplating is how we can go and actually serve as chaplains and just be present in the seniors' residences within the neighborhood of our church. These aren't people who necessarily are going to be fun to be with, but we're looking at how can we not only be advocates for life at an issue level and preach about these things, but how can we go and be amongst not just like the fun senior citizens in brave power, but actually be amongst those who are the least fun people to be with, who are depressed and who are dying and who really are contemplating help being put to death. And so one of the ways that one of the things I encourage you to do is do something that I did a few years ago as I started having the privilege of walking with people who were in really rough places, which is to Google how to help someone not commit suicide. Just Google it. Be creative in what you Google, because I had to type in a few things, and I just read there's really good stuff online, and it's really simple. You'll have the sermon online. What is this? What poppycock, and what is actually good advice? I trust you guys. Google it and be ready, because when that phone call came in, I had already looked and found some info and was able to help them. And I'm not someone who trains people on how to help people not commit suicide. I've received some of that training myself, but I'm not yet in a place where I feel confident being that expert for you. But the expert advice is readily available thanks to Google. I encourage you to do it. Some of the things I've learned to do is what I did on that phone that evening I'm speaking of. Evening is too kind. That night, that late night that I was speaking to this young woman out in Alberta, was I asked her like who inspires her, and I asked her like, who some of those questions where you start to get them to think outside of their own cage of darkness. And this is the type of stuff you learn as you just go and look for good advice about how to walk with people. And you help them start moving beyond their own pain. I have a little bit of research for you right here regarding those who actually contemplate and attempt suicide. A careful British study, which involved extensive interviews and examination of medical records, found that 93% of those who the study found who wanted to commit suicide, or who actually committed suicide, were mentally ill at the time. A similar St. Louis study found that mental disorder was present in 94% of those who committed suicide. Now, that's not to say that these are people you would recognize as mentally ill, or these are the other that is so different from ourselves, but rather to say that there's often something more going on when someone actually wants death. And what we need to do is care for those who are struggling with some mental challenges, not assist them in committing suicide. We also found that Dr. Peter Admiral, he's a leader in the Netherlands pushing for euthanasia and assisted suicide, which they achieved there. He actually has publicly said in his arguments for it that pain is never an adequate justification for euthanasia or assisted suicide. In light of current medical techniques, they can manage pain in virtually all circumstances. One of the reasons many give for needing assisted suicide, where they try to paint a picture of for your compassion, for your action, is by saying that, what about those people suffering in such terrible pain? And I've heard from him, who's a leader in the movement for assisted suicide, and from others saying that there's such good pain care medication treatment today, that is not a reason that we should be putting someone to death. We must be people who seek to alleviate suffering, not eliminate the sufferers. Mm-hmm. You with me? We must be people who seek to eliminate suffering, not alleviate suffering, not eliminate the sufferers. And as long as society is okay with eliminating sufferers, we're not going to do the harder task of actually being with them in their pain. But that is what we must do. And so that is some of the practical solutions to the demand for assisted suicide, is to be people who are present, and to lead our congregations in being present with those who want death, recognizing that there's something wrong, recognizing that there's real pain. We call tonight's talk Weeping with Those Who Weep, because in Romans 12:15, as Paul writes about letting love be genuine, he says, weep with those who weep. Again, it's not just campaign against those who weep, but it's be present with them in their suffering. To stand with the vulnerable means placing yourself in a position of vulnerability. But God does not simply, though it is a beautiful thing, care for the practical need for food and care for the practical need for sleep. God speaks into Elijah's life, and he answers this request for suicide, for death, by saying no, and by speaking into his situation. And likewise, we as people need to not only care for those who are suffering amongst us, but we have a responsibility as citizens, I believe, to respond to the demand for assisted suicide, to respond to the Supreme Court decision, and to respond to this political movement for assisted suicide, by also speaking into the culture and the politics.
Yeah.
And there's some beautiful and much needed lessons we can learn on how to speak into the politics by looking at how God speaks to Elijah. The first thing the central thing, the integral thing I want to draw your attention to regarding God's response to Elijah is that God speaks Hebrew to Elijah. God speaks the language that Elijah speaks to Elijah.
Yeah.
God could have responded speaking some mystical language of heaven. God could have chosen to speak tongues to Elijah, that's a very spiritual language. But God speaks Hebrew to Elijah. He speaks a language using words, using a discourse that Elijah could understand. I work part-time at Parliament Hall. I used to be full-time, but now I work mostly at the church as an intern. And intern life, I've kept a part-time job so I can pay my bills. And just today I was in the office, received a phone call from someone who doesn't like what the government is doing. And he ranted about whatever he ranted about. He didn't give his name, he didn't give his postal code. I have no idea if he's a constituent or not. And although I was polite to him, I invited him to contact us by email or by mail, or identify who he is and all that. He didn't. He refused to do that. And maybe he'll be watching this later. I just want to say to him, sir, you wasted your time. Politicians, two words that will matter a lot, that you would do very well to learn how to speak the language of politicians, is constituent and stakeholder. Okay. If you're not a constituent or a stakeholder for a politician, they have a lot better things to do with their time. There's a lot of people who want them to vote a lot of different ways. But what politicians in Canada and the United States care about, because we're democracies, is representing the views of their people. Because some politicians believe that's their job, and all politicians know that's what they need to do to get elected. So constituent and stakeholder are words that they understand. And because this person, if he refused to identify his name or where he lives or anything like that, my boss is not going to care who this guy is or what his opinion. Well, she doesn't care who his opinion is. It matters nothing. And so if we need to be people who are our political activism and involvement is not done just to get it off our chest, but to actually make a difference, we need to learn how to do this. I guarantee you that this guy is going to go to sleep tonight feeling so good because he just beat up a young intern on the phone today. He was able to just get it off his chest, and I'm glad to be a listening ear for him. He doesn't know he's also talking to like a pastor in training, so just that listening ear. But he wasted his time. As I look around this room tonight, we'll see that there's not a lot of people in the room tonight, though I am pleased that you're all here. But if we're going to make a difference, then those of us who care about the sanctity of human life, those of us who actually understand that assisted suicide is bringing the death of vulnerable, mentally ill, and disabled Canadians who've lost hope, and what they need is hope, not death, then we need to make sure that we few are an effective few. And so I want to encourage you to do a few things. First, I want to say I'm glad that some have come from far away to be at the March for Life. That's big, and I'm glad you're here. But as somebody who works in politics and there's rallies outside of our office every day, I urge you to not let your activism and your political voice come to a conclusion with a march. That's only the beginning. I really believe that one of the great reasons for the march is for us to have spin-off events like this, and for us to network with each other, and for us to encourage each other to continue to be involved. But the march needs to be just the very, very beginning, the beginning of the beginning of our activism. Otherwise, I don't think you're making a difference at all. I think you're just making yourself be able to sleep well at night. That's selfish, that's not love. So how can we actually be effective advocates for life? Well, there's a few things you can do. One is more than just marching. I'd encourage you to contact your MP, your member of parliament, or if you're from the States, your congressman, and include your name and your postal code writing to your representative. Because if you write to your representative with your postal code, they see that you are a voting person, and they'll actually care about what you say. So I encourage you to do that by email or by mail. I encourage you to do that. However, when you do that, your letter will come to someone like me. And even though I'm a bit of a veteran of Parliament Hill, I'm not an intern at Parliament Hill, I've worked there for a long time, and I'll come to someone like me, and I will respond to your letter. I'll write a response in my boss's name. My boss may write her name at the bottom of the letter. In some offices, they have a stamp that they'll stamp, or some offices have an arm that can do the signature, and the letter will go back to you. So although a letter or an email with your postal code is important somewhat, I would say it's barely more than a march. It's barely more than a march. I encourage you to do it, but there's more you can do. You've been a little bit more effective, barely, would be if you were to circulate among your friends or even your church a petition. Now petitions, they have to have specific requirements. One of them is that you need at least 25 signatures on your petition. And the others, there's some specific things about how the top text of the petition should be, how to format it. And you can find all that info by going to Google and typing in Petition Parliament of Canada. That's all you need to do. I checked again this afternoon. It's the first thing that comes up. It's the guidebook from the parliamentary website about how to craft a good petition. So go do it and circulate a petition. One of the best things that this will do is that it will I don't know how much it actually will influence a politician, I have my doubts, but it will help members in your community and your church see that they can have a voice, they can be part of the political discourse. And so it's good for helping people start caring. I think in some ways it's better for us than it is for actual politics, but it's still a positive thing. So I encourage you to do it. But so much more effective than mail, emails, or petitions is meeting with a member of parliament. Now that is a lot more difficult because it actually takes you going somewhere, doing something, and using more of your precious, rare commodity of time. But I encourage you to do this, if you actually care. If you're indifferent to the whole issue of animals being put to death and babies being aborted and all that, if you're indifferent, then just, I don't know why you leave tonight, but if you actually care, meet with the MP. I say this as someone who's been there for 7 years, and I have seen members of parliament break from their party line. I've worked with cabinet ministers who have gone against their party line, who've gone against the Prime Minister on certain issues. There was one time I was working with one of my bosses, a very senior member of parliament, and it was an issue that I cared a lot about as a social conservative, and we had written tons of letters back to constituents saying she would vote a certain way, it was the way I wanted her to vote. And then the vote came, and she voted against the way she promised, against the Prime Minister's wish. Like it was a gutsy stand she took, exactly opposite to the one I wanted her to take. I was aghast, and when I heard from her why she voted the way she did, she referred to the people who had come to her office. She had met them, and she said, as I went to stand up to vote, I saw their face, and I had to stay seated for the no vote or the yes vote, and I had to stand up for the no vote. Wow. I truly believe in my 7 years in politics. I've written a book on politics, but I've worked there. I've been on the inside for 7 years, and I promise you that meeting with MPs makes a difference. So you meet with your MP that you're a constituent of, and they'll care, at least somewhat, what you have to say. It shows that you're actually active. But the second thing would be those who are pastors in this place, I encourage you to meet with them and present yourself as a stakeholder. A stakeholder is someone who not only has a stake in the issue, but someone who represents a specific demographic. And you're not breaking your ability to give tax receipts as a church. You're not violating your commitment to not do political stuff as your church. Your politician wants to know what the different demographics in his constituency speak. Even if you're a church of a very small congregation that lost their name in their building because of a principled stand you took, and you represent very few people, maybe it's just your children, very small church, you go and you meet with the MP and you say, I am the pastor of Bethlehem Church in whatever, Prince Edward Island. They'll care, even if it's just 3 people, because they'll see you as someone who's involved in the community, and so they'll really care what you have to say. I encourage you to do it. I have no idea why anyone would not do it, unless if you're indifferent. So we'll have some Q&A time at the end, and if there's a reason you think not to meet with your MP, but I encourage you, if you do it. I belabor the point because I believe it's worth belaboring. Finally, 2 more thoughts on politics. One is, the reason a lot of us don't do this is because, and I didn't do it as a high school student, though I was passionate about these issues, is I just did not feel like I had the words or the eloquence to make a convincing case. I felt that I couldn't articulate my position well enough. Politicians know that they're the MPs. They love that they are the MP, that they're the professional politician, and that you're not. They don't expect you to come with a great argument. In fact, they're not really necessarily looking to be convinced that your position is a moral position. They simply want to know you are someone who votes. You have friends who vote, and this is how you want them to vote.
Yeah.
And it affects them, and they'll talk to their colleagues. So I encourage you, there's no excuse not to meet with an MP. The third thing is that members of parliament care even more than about stakeholders or constituents. They care even more about those who are actively involved as supporters. So when someone writes to us and they say, we've been donating to you for years, we put up a lawn sign and we helped campaign for you, and we're thinking of voting for a party with a very young leader who has no experience. When they write that to us, all of a sudden like, oh, okay, stop everything. We need not only their vote, because that's just one vote, but we need their money, and we need their lawn sign, and we need them to be campaigning for us. So I encourage you to be people who get involved in politics, to get involved in October in the election campaign in Canada, so that in a few years' time, when there's an issue that comes up that you really care about, You've earned their ears. To encourage you, meet with them even if you've never done any, even if you don't never vote. Maybe you're visiting Anglicans for Life, but you're actually Mennonite and you don't get involved in politics. Meet with them anyways. But it'd be even better if you get involved in some way. And you can even, again, as pastors, if you don't feel like you want to represent your church campaigning, you can still campaign, like help them as an individual. It's a good thing. Do it. Yeah, we have a responsibility as citizens, as neighbors, to get involved in the discussions, the discourse. And we see that God did not just care for the practical needs. God did not just bake him a cake. God baked him a cake, and then God responded clearly with a no and spoke into Elijah's situation, confronting Elijah's beliefs. He spoke right into it in the language that Elijah could understand. I encourage you to do the same. Just before we move on to pastoral solutions, I want to just very quickly read to you a few arguments about euthanasia and about assisted suicide rather, and why it should not be legal. That I think would resonate is speak the language that politicians from any faith or no faith at all can understand. So the first is that a request for assisted suicide is typically a cry for help. It is in reality a call for counseling, assistance, and positive alternatives as solutions for very real problems. Second, suicidal intent is typically transient, meaning it's not something that tends to stay for a very long time. However, when someone actually receives assisted suicide, it's a fairly permanent Of those who attempt suicide but are stopped, less than 4% go on to kill themselves in the next 5 years. Less than 11% will commit suicide within the next 35 years. So again, this is something you can share with politicians, saying this is a reason to not have assisted suicide, because suicidal desire for assisted suicide is transient. Third, terminally ill patients who desire death are often depressed, and depression is treatable in those with terminal illness. In one study of the 24% of terminally ill patients who desire death, all had clinical depression. 4, which I mentioned earlier, is that pain is controllable. Modern medicine has the ability to control pain. A person who seeks to kill him or herself, or seeks help in killing him or herself to avoid pain, does not need to legalize assisted suicide, but a doctor better trained in alleviating pain. That's what they need. So we can push for better palliative care treatment, but not for killing people. We'll skip that one, is irrelevant, it's another country. That one again we'll skip. What you'll see, the points I just spoke to you about, is that none of them are about a slippery slope. I could be wrong on this, but I believe while there is a very, very strong, can I get water, Paul?
Yeah.
This too short. Wow. Thank you for your patience. Wow, there's a very strong case to be made for the legalization of assisted suicide as being as leading to a slippery slope. And there's so much stats and research you can look up. There's something stronger about an argument that doesn't rely on a slippery slope. Because the response to that will always be, well, let's get better safeguards to prevent against a slippery slope. That's a direction we don't want to end up in. How can we make sure we legalize things but don't end up there? So I'm a strong believer in finding arguments that rely on more than a slippery slope. Okay, I'll be succinct for the remainder of my talk. I'm trying to race against my voice going out. Okay, so we have practical solutions is being present, caring for people's practical needs, whether it's the pain they feel or it is mental illness or disabilities, to care for them, be present in their pain. Political solutions is quite simply write emails or write letters if you still like doing that. Circulate petitions, they're pretty simple. And third, so much more, meet with the MP. If you only do one thing, make sure it's that. Third, pastoral responses. The most beautiful thing in this passage is not, I believe, that God provides some baked cakes for Elijah or sleep. Though with the business of life, those both sound very good to me. Nor is it simply that God says no and does not give Elijah what he wants, which is death. It speaks into that situation. Political response. to the demand for sister suicide. The most beautiful thing is that God himself is present. God does not just care for his physical needs, God cares for his soul. God reveals his himself to Elijah in an even more intimate way than what Elijah experienced up on the mountain, Mount Carmel. It's a beautiful, beautiful passage before us. And I believe that this speaks to each one of us, pastors, interns, and laymen, all of us, that there's a pastoral, as emissaries of the light, as ambassadors of God, we have a role speaking into the society. Not only speaking in a language that politics understand, and the reasons I gave politically for why we should have assisted suicide, those reasons I read to you, none of them spoke of God, none of them spoke of the hope we have in him. And sometimes it's very helpful when you meet with an MP to give them these reasons. It's not use spiritual language, just reasons that they'll understand, reasons they can articulate in Parliament. But there is so much more we have to offer society than political and just practical solutions, but rather the very words of hope that people who are contemplating, who are in despair, need. Now on Wednesday nights, I'm not usually here, rather I'm at the University of Ottawa, just a few blocks away, for Church on Wednesday. It's the ministry of Church of Messiah, an Anglican church, together with a Baptist church as well as a Calvary chapel. The three churches combined together right in the most public part of the university. It's like an open door concept inside in the main artery of the university, so there's always people walking by and joining us. And every week we have non-believing students, people of all faiths and no faiths, Hindus, Muslims, all sorts join us, as well as agnostics. And mostly though there's Christians, both people who are strong in their faith and students who haven't been to church in 2 years since they came to a new city, never bothered to find a church. We brought the local church to them Wednesday nights. It's the first time in 2014 or 15 I'm missing it. It'll be the only time in 2015 I'm missing it, Lord willing, is to be with you guys tonight. And last week, I preach every second week, and last week I spoke on this verse, 1 Peter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You and I, as people of God, are a priesthood, we're a holy nation, we're people for God's own possession, that not just a people of God's own possession for our own piety, but a people of God's own possession that we, you and I, may proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into marvelous light. I believe that this speaks into how we address the issue of assisted suicide, that each one of us has a story. We each have a testimony of how God has brought us out of darkness, out of places that were where we were spiritually dead. People who may have had various things going on in our lives, but who ultimately had no hope. And that God, every single one of us, if we are sons and daughters of God, have this testimony that God has brought us out of darkness into his excellent light, that we may proclaim the goodness of God. And this is what we have to offer a society that thinks that the right to life, liberty, and security of a person means a right to death and a right to assisted suicide. And so I want to call on each one of us to prayerfully look at how we can speak into this society, how we can have our churches be places, be people, not just institutions, but be a vibrant community that speaks of hope and light that we find in God. How we can speak into society and speak into all this as people who know God. That as people who are carriers of God's presence, that we would not only care for someone's practically, but that we actually share with them, pray with them, and be chaplains in our societies. As I prepared for tonight, I was looking for a good quote, which I didn't find, but some years ago, when I was doing history at the University of Ottawa, I did my master's in it, I did some extensive research on the Confessing Church. The Confessing Church is famously remembered for resisting the Nazis during the Holocaust. It was various Protestant churches came together to form this kind of new denomination at that time. But as I did research, I couldn't find any real action they took to care for the Jewish neighbors of theirs. I found that they resisted the Nazis on theology. The Nazis were trying to kind of reinvent Christian theology and chop out parts of the Bible, and they kept their Bibles, with 66 books in it, but they made a conscious decision to not speak about what was happening in their day. And it's that all too typical belief among Christians. They were called simply to care for people's souls, to simply speak the message of God offering forgiveness for our sin, but not actually to speak into what is actually happening. There's a few pastors, led by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who broke away from what their bishops told them to do, and they spoke about how the gospel, how the scriptures actually speak into the issues that they were facing with the Holocaust, how they speak into how to respond to Nuremberg laws. And I want to challenge you as pastors who are here today to be people who are willing to speak about the uncomfortable and even controversial issues. To be people who can speak about issues regarding abortion, regarding euthanasia and assisted suicide, even if it means you offend people in your congregation, even if it means you offend people who died, even if it means, for some of you, offending your bishops and overseers, as some of these did in the confessing church back in the Holocaust, back in those days. We need to be able to show our congregations how the Bible speaks into these current day controversies and issues. So I want to end by quoting another verse, which is, I believe it's Proverbs 29:7, which says that many men seek the face of the ruler, but from the Lord comes justice. On tomorrow morning, we're going to go to Parliament Hill, and in a sense, we're seeking the face of the ruler, trying to get them to see our 20,000 faces. But I want to encourage us that as we go back afterward to our home parishes, to be people who, more than anything, more than care for practical needs, more than meeting with politicians, more than even be people who are preaching the gospel and sharing how the Bible speaks into these things, that we're prayerful people. That we're people who are not only seeking the face of rulers, but seeking God himself, from whom justice and compassion flow. So as we go back to our churches, my prayer, and I believe our hope for all of us, is that we would see churches that be growing and be planting church in all of us across Canada as Anglicans, that are not isolated islands of personal piety, but that are robust communities, that are reaching into their neighborhoods to be present, to care for the practical needs of their neighbors, who are able to engage in the political discourse. But more than anything, are bastions pointing to, are lighthouses pointing to the one who not only weeps with those who weep, but who one day will wipe away the tears of every eye. Let's pray again. Heavenly Father, thank you that you are present here. We thank you for your compassion, that in your compassion you've not only delivered your people out of Egypt and brought them into the promised land, but you have delivered each one of us from darkness and brought us into glorious light and hope and freedom, and given us meaning and purpose and joy through your leaving the comfortable throne of heaven and coming and standing with us in our vulnerability of the human condition, taking upon yourself our woundedness and our sins and all of our brokenness in real time and real space. And even as Jesus, you've gone back to the throne in heaven and you're interceding for us, we thank you that you've not left us as orphans, but you've given us your Holy Spirit. And Lord, we look to you that you would help us walk with you here in Canada among the broken, that you would help us to continue on the work that you have not only called us to do, but are doing yourself through us here in Canada. That you would give us the privilege of getting to walk with those who are contemplating suicide. That you would help us to help them not choose that path. And that you would also help us to be able to speak into society and culture and politics. Help us as we go and meet with MPs, hopefully. Lord, help us to be able to do these things effectively, speaking the language that they understand. But more than anything, pointing people to you, the very one in whom we find life itself. Not just the best life, but life itself. We love you so much. Lead us in you in Jesus' name. Amen.